King David of the Bible is an iconic figure in Western culture, yet in many ways, he's a misunderstood figure also. God called David a man after his own heart, and that statement has been used by atheists to justify their disbelief that a man as flawed as David could represent a perfect God, so there must not be a God. And on the other side of the spectrum, God's affirmation of David, who was a very sinful man, has been used by Christians to justify their support for sinful, flawed political leaders. After all, David was known to have committed adultery and murder of one of his close supporters. So, how are we to understand God's support of this sinful leader? And what lessons are appropriate to draw from that support? Well, we don't need to guess or follow our own logic. Instead, we need to go to the Bible to see what it has to say about David, God, and the lessons that we should learn. Now, in modern societies today, we do not expect a lot of good from the leaders of our governments. I mean, we're happy if they hold their office with the minimum of crime. We even have a saying that explains politicians' descent into the unethical and even the criminal behavior. Power corrupts, and ultimate power corrupts ultimately. Although we see this rule in action all the time nowadays, we can also see this truism played out again and again in the Bible. After all, the Sanhedrin killed the very God that they claimed to serve because of their jealousy of his power and their fear of the Romans. Pilate condemned an innocent man to death because he feared that he would lose his power if the Jews told their lies to Caesar. And farther back, King Herod the Great killed babies under the 2 years of age because he wanted to keep his power. In fact, in the Old Testament, most of the kings of Israel and Judah were filled with corruption, murder, and hypocrisy. And yet there is one of those kings that is held up to us as a shining example of leadership. David. Now, David was not the first king of Israel. That honor went to King Saul, and true to our saying about power corrupting, Saul allowed his power to overwhelm his obedience to his God. When Saul's corruption had reached a point where he needed to be replaced, the prophet Samuel told Saul that he was to be replaced and that his successor would be a man after God's own heart. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 13 to 14, we see the words, "And Samuel said to Saul, 'You've done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be his prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you.'" Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? David was a man after God's own heart. But what does that mean? Well, let's understand by contrasting Saul with David. One of my favorite authors says of Saul that God gave Israel a king after their own heart. In Patriarchs and Prophets, it says, "Therefore God gave them such a king as they desired, one whose character was a reflection of their own." Yeah, Saul reflected the character of the people. Remember, this is the people who had demanded a king from the prophet Samuel, even in the face of his warnings that God's plan for them was to be a nation without a king. Saul was a king of the same quality who decided that God needed to do what Saul wanted God to do, rather than patiently following God's commands. If being after the people's own heart meant that Saul reflected the people's character, then being after God's own heart must mean that David reflected God's character. Really? How did David reflect God's own character? I mean, after all, the Bible itself reveals a lot of terrible truths about David's actions. The first sins that we all think of course, are adultery and murder. He stole another man's wife, and when he couldn't hide his sin, he had that man killed. Oh yeah, he didn't do it directly, but he was responsible. But that was not his only problem. He had way too many wives, setting a bad example for his son Solomon, who went way beyond his father's collection of spouses. In addition, David was definitely not Father of the Year. When his daughter was raped, sure, he was angry, but he didn't do much for her. He didn't punish his guilty son, and he ended up letting her live as a desolate woman in her brother's house. And what kind of father raises a son who would rape his own sister anyway? And in fact, God showed that he knew that David was not the perfect poster child to represent the kingdom of heaven, because God refused to let David build the temple. And the reason he gave was that David's hands were full of blood. Now, there's a lot more that could be added to this list of David's flaws, but I think what I've brought up here is enough to make my point. By modern standards, David was as bad as many of our politicians that we condemn today. So, how was he a man who reflected God's character? Well, in my opinion, the secret of understanding the relationship between God's heart and David's heart is not found in the books of Samuel or Kings, or most of the other places that mention King David and his exploits. The key to David's heart is found in the songs that he wrote, which are found in the book of Psalms. And in his music, David poured out his innermost feelings and revealed what he was thinking at key points in his life. So today I'd like to examine a few of David's Psalms to answer the question, how was David a man after God's own heart? Well, first let's talk about David the sinner, since that has become the obstacle of atheists and the justification for supporting corrupt politicians. Through his songs, David has let us know how he felt when he was breaking God's commandments. Most famous is Psalm 51, which talks about David's plea for forgiveness after Nathan the prophet confronted him about his sin of adultery with Bathsheba. But that's not the psalm that I want to look at now. I want us to go to Psalm 38. As we read this psalm, think about how David says that he feels about having disobeyed God's commands. In other words, Psalms 38, 1-10 reveals to us what the sinner David was thinking and feeling about what he had done. Now, in verses 1 and 2, notice how David was feeling while under the conviction of the Holy Spirit that God was condemning his actions. Verses 1 and 2 say, a Psalm of David for the memorial offering. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath, for your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. In other words, David knew that he had done wrong, and he was feeling as if the arrows of God's rebuke, had sunk deep into his soul, finding their targets in his thoughts. And then in verses 3 through 8, David goes on. Notice how David reacts to being under the conviction of wrongdoing. These verses reveal how badly David was feeling about having sinned. There's no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There's no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They're too heavy for me. My wounds stink and fester because of my foolishness. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate. All the day I go about mourning. For my sides are filled with burning, and there's no soundness in my flesh. I'm feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. These verses show that David is physically and emotionally affected from knowing that he has chosen to place himself in opposition to God. But it's in verse 9 and 10 that we can really find the key to understanding David's heart. These verses demonstrate that David's deepest desire was to be right with God. He was not worried about being caught or about hurting other people or about losing power. He was worried about being made right with God. Verses 9 and 10. O Lord, all my longing is before you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs, my strength fails me, and the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. Now, Psalm 38 goes on with a lot of other great lessons, but for now, we're just focusing on the parts that open up to us how David was somehow similar to God in character. So what does this psalm tell us about David's character? Well, first of all, he was connected to God. He felt the condemnation of the Holy Spirit, and he wanted to please God. He was desolate when he knew that God was condemning him. And most of all, David longed with all of his heart to be connected with God. Here's the key to the question of how David could be a man after God's own heart, even with all his sins. You see, David wanted God in the same way that God wanted David. And when we read about David's battles and his problems and his family conflicts and his failings, we sometimes forget that David was a deeply spiritual man who longed for God with deep emotions. In fact, he loved God more than anyone or anything else in his life, including being a king. So let's look at another psalm where we can clearly see David's heart. Psalm 63, verses 1 to 3. A psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. So what have we learned so far? Well, we have shown that the atheist is wrong to focus on David's sin as a reflection of God. Instead, we can see that the reason for God saying that David was a man after his own heart was because of the love that David felt for God. David wanted to be connected to God more than he wanted power, women, or wealth. Now let's look at some applications. Is the application that we should bring into our own lives from these verses that we can excuse politicians for their sins, since David sinned? Well, we've learned that David never excused himself. And I don't believe David would give excuses for others. He confronted his own sin and he repented. He turned away from his sins and towards God. The Bible never excuses sin. Jesus died because sin cannot be excused. So, the first application from studying David's character and motivations is that you can vote for anyone you wish for, but never try to excuse their greed, their sexual sin, or their compromising of integrity in the name of power by pointing to David. Well, in that case, what is the correct application of this study? Well, the answer is you. What does this tell you about yourself? Are you a man, a woman, a child after God's own heart? Do you thirst for God as a thirsty animal wants a drink of cool water on a hot day? Think about that kind of thirst. Do you remember a day when you were working hard and sweating and had not had a drink for a while and your mouth was dry and you really wanted a drink of cool water? Is that how you feel about God? Because it was how David felt. Now, we are not to emulate David's actions. Instead, we need to focus on copying the kind of relationship that he had with God. Psalm 40, 1 through 13 will tell us more about David's relationship with God. In verses 1 to 3, David speaks about how God helped him and how David felt about that. To the choir master, a psalm of David. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. David is saying that he trusts God, and that when people see how God has helped him, they'll trust God also. Well, do you have that kind of relationship with God? Do you trust God when you're going through your miry bogs? Do you wait patiently for the Lord to hear your cries? And do you sing God's praises because He answers your prayers and makes your steps secure? Will others see God working in your life and put their trust in the Lord? Because that was David's experience. Then in verses 4 to 5, it says, Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts towards us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. David clearly saw that God was a God of beauty who loved people. David wanted to tell people how great God was, but he felt inadequate because God was so much more than David could ever describe in songs or words. Well, what about you? Do you see God's beauty? Do you want to tell others how much the God you serve loves them, but words fail you? Well, that was David's experience also. Then in verses 6 to 10, he goes on to say, In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will. O my God, your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. Yes, this is a messianic prophecy, but it's also David's relationship to God. David knew that God heard him with an open ear when he prayed. He knew that God was not listening just because David had made sacrifices or done some big job for God. He knew that God was always listening. David understood that obeying the law was not about outward obedience. He knew that it was about having the law in his heart, and when he was rescued from danger or from the results of his own sinfulness, he never claimed that the victory came from himself. Instead, he always pointed to the God of heaven. Most of all, David knew deep down in every part of himself that God loved him and God would never fail him. And David couldn't keep that knowledge to himself, so he had to tell everyone about God's love and faithfulness. What about you? Do you understand that God loves you no matter what you've done? Do you understand that God is more concerned about your heart than your actions? And do you trust God to love you and be faithful to you always? David did. In the next verses, David makes it clear that he knows that he's a sinner and that his only hope is in God's mercy and love. He knows that he lives only by God's grace and that when he falls to sin again and again, God is his only hope. Verses 11 to 13. As for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Years later, centuries later, Jesus would reveal these truths clearly in his sacrifice on the cross. And Paul and Peter and James and John would expound on these truths so that even the dullest human could understand. But long before these great revelations, David already knew God, and he wanted to be with God. And David hated the fact that his sinfulness separated him from God. And David trusted God to be love and mercy and faithfulness, even when David was not. Why was David a man after God's own heart? It's like I said before. David wanted God, like God wanted David. David's psalms to God teach us that being a person after God's own heart is not about being perfect and sinless. David sure wasn't. Pleasing God is not about a list of do's and don'ts. It's not about not doing the bad things and doing a certain number of good things. It's not about whether you've given enough in the offering plate or listened to the right music or attended church the right number of times. Being a person after God's own heart means that you want Him like He wants you. You want His love and His forgiveness and His presence in your life. In short, you don't want anything to separate you from God. You want to tell other people about His goodness, but you find that the words fail you when you start to realize how really wonderful God is. And most of all, you trust God to be beautiful inside and out, even when you are not. The question now is not whether David was sinful. He was. It's not whether you are full of sin. You are. The question now is, are you a man or a woman or a child after God's own heart? I want to leave you with David's words in Psalm 40, verses 16 to 17. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, "Great is the Lord." And as for me, I'm poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God.